Hello and welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible class. Tonight we're in Judges chapter 12 and we're going to be studying about Jephthah's conflict with Ephraim. Tonight's lesson will probably be a little shorter than usual because I divided the lesson of Jephthah up into 3 lessons instead of just 1 or 2. But they're, as I mentioned in a previous lesson, in studying it again, I saw some things that previously I didn't really emphasize, and so I wanted to do that this time around. Let's get to the slides here. In the first 7 verses here, what we have is Jephthah's conflict with Ephraim. And we're going to see this should be kind of familiar with us in studying through Judges, because Ephraim did the same thing with Gideon, which we'll review a little bit later. But Ephraim comes to Jephthah and accuses him of not calling them to go to battle. When we look at verse 1, it says, "Then the men of Ephraim gathered together, crossed over toward Zaphon, and said to Jephthah, 'Why do you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon, and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire.'" And so they're extremely upset. And the whole root of their problem is envy. And we might even add to that pride or vainglory. But the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, tells us in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 30, "A sound heart is life to the body, but envy is rottenness to the bones." In Luke chapter 14 and verse 10, Jesus says when you're invited, he says, go sit in the lowest place. And then when the master comes, or the person who invited you comes, he may say to you, go up higher. But don't put yourself up higher, because ultimately what happens is when you try to make yourself higher, you end up making yourself lower. And it always works that way. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 26, "Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, and envying one another." And that, when you see here conceit and envy, that is the whole problem of the Ephraimites, and they're doing exactly what Paul here says not to do, and that is provoke one another. And, Jephthah is a type of man, they may have thought back when they dealt with Gideon, and they think, well, they're dealing with someone like Gideon. Well, they're not, as they're going to find out. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself." And so Jephthah's conflict with Ephraim the fault is totally on Ephraim, and it's rooted in conceit and vainglory. And I mentioned a moment ago they had done the same thing with Gideon. We go back to chapter 8, look at verses 1 to 3. "Now the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?' And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezar? God delivered unto your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?' Then their anger toward him abated when he said that." But Gideon's very diplomatic, and he really, in my mind, what he's doing here is flattery, and so he assuages their anger here. And they might have thought that this is what Jephthah was going to do. And he does at first offer, a reasonable explanation, and basically tells them that the fault is their own and not his, that if they wanted a laurel of victory, then they could have had it if they had come when Jephthah called them. Look at verses 2 and 3. And Jephthah said to them, "My people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon, and I called you, and you did not deliver me out of their hands." And so Jephthah says, you want the laurel of victory, you want to take pride, and you want to march in the victory parade, but you didn't want to come to battle when I called you. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? And so you might say here that Jephthah is showing some pride when he says here, and I have this underlined on the slide, you can see here, I took my life in my hands. But then in the next sentence he says, the Lord delivered them into my hand. Is Jephthah here saying that everything depended on me? I took my life into my hands? Well, it wouldn't make sense if that's what he meant when he says in the very next breath, the Lord delivered them into my hand. We're going to see on the next slide that David said something here very similar, or Jonathan said it about David, when he said he took his life into his hands. What that means is I risked my life. I was willing to, go into battle and risk my life and just depend on the Lord. And the point, however, now is that Jephthah is not puffing himself up with vainglory, but he acknowledges that God is the one who had given them the victory. Here's a text I was talking to you about a moment ago, 1 Samuel chapter 19, verses 4 and 5. Thus Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. For he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? And so very similar language is used here about David that Jephthah also used, and that is that they were willing to depend on the Lord and really risk their lives, ultimately putting their lives in the Lord's hands, or depending on the Lord for their life. And so he gives them a reasonable explanation, but obviously Ephraim persists here in their anger, because Jephthah is not going to have any more of it, and he and the Gileadites end up slaughtering 42,000 of the Ephraimites. And it's a terrible thing. Here you have 42,000 men of Ephraim who have just been slaughtered. What they have done here is not smart. You think about the kind of man Jephthah is. He has, and it's not hard to understand, I don't think anyway. It's not hard to understand Jephthah's disposition. He's just gone to battle, and he was in trouble and called upon others to help him, and they wouldn't help him. And now they're coming and they're asking him, why didn't you call us? Plus the fact he made this rash vow, this foolish vow, and concerning his daughter, and he didn't know at the time it was going to be his daughter, but it ended up being his daughter, and so he has to deal with that. And so when I think about Jephthah, this in chapter 12, I think about a grumpy old bear. And one thing you don't do with a grumpy old bear is go up and start poking him with a stick. And this is exactly what Ephraim is doing, and they're going to feel the wrath not only of Jephthah, but all of the Gileadites. And this is a interesting thing that they do here. We look at back at Judges chapter 12, beginning of verse 4. Now Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim, and the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they said, "You Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites." And so they were, adding fuel to the fire. They called the Gileadites, who had just won this battle and given the whole nation victory against the Ammonites, just called them a bunch of fugitive, a bunch of criminals. And this when we go back to chapter 11, we see that there was a band of brigands, basically, that joined to Jephthah, and they would go out and they would raid the Ammonites. And so, the Ephraimites perhaps thought, well, this bunch, these, maybe thought they were gangsters and said, well, they're not as sophisticated as we are, and just start calling them fugitives. So, verse 5, the Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. And when any Ephraimite who escaped said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead would say to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he said no, then they would say to him, "Then say Shibboleth." And he would say Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they would take him and kill him at the fords of the Jordan, and there fell at that time 42,000 Ephraimites. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died, was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. And so we get kind of a proverb today based on what happened here. The Gileadite men, and they crossed over the Jordan to confront Jephthah, and obviously you have tens of thousands of them. And the Ephraimites, rather, cross over to confront Jephthah. And so the Gileadites, they go and seize the crossing, so when the Ephraimites want to go back home, they're going to kill them. And the way they could tell whether or not they were an Ephraimite is they asked them to say Shibboleth. And evidently the Ephraimites could not make the SH sound. And so they would say Sibboleth. And you say, well, anybody can say Shibboleth. Well, you listen to some of the different dialects of people from other cultures and other countries. Think about Arabic. Think about how Hebrew is spoken. And a lot of the pronunciations are done in different places in the mouth and different places in the throat that we're just not used to. We're not used to speaking that way. Think about some of the Asian languages and how they pronounce their words and how they speak. There are things there that it's just be difficult, if not impossible, for an American to repeat without an incredible amount of training and learning. So the Ephraimites aren't going to learn in less than a day how to say something that they're not used to saying. And so they're going to be slaughtered. So they're big talkers. We're going to burn your house down. We're going to burn you in your house. Basically what they said is, we're going to burn your house down on top of you. But they're not going to do that. It's the old saying, their bark is worse than their bite. What we have here is kind of a proverb that has come down since this time, and it's even used today. And Shibboleth has come to be known as a test of whose side you're on. If you you've probably heard the saying, you're speaking my language. And so if people speak in a certain way, if they use a certain vocabulary, then it's evidence of, whose side you're on or they're on. And, there is a lesson here, and it's not a good thing in many respects, but there is a lesson here to be learned. And that is that our words tell a great deal about us, either positively or negatively. And oftentimes you can read between the lines, and you can know things about a person just based on the vocabulary that they use. Now, I'm not talking about their particular dialect or the way that they speak. For instance, if you hear someone speaking from the Northeast, well, you can tell that person is from the Northeast. Anyone who hears me speak can tell that I'm, have lived in the South for a long time. So this is not what I'm talking about, however. The words that we use tell a great deal about us. And so we need to be careful as Christians that we use kind words, that we use wholesome words, and not speak in such a way that it reflects badly upon ourselves, badly upon the Lord, or badly upon anyone else. 6 years, Jephthah judged Israel. We read this in verse 7. And we're going to see, through the rest of the chapter here, that these other judges, you have Ibzan, his sons, and Abdon, and all of his offspring. But Jephthah doesn't have any offspring. You don't read about how many children he had. All you know about is his daughter, and that she did not marry, and she did not bear any children. And so Jephthah's line ended. Here again, I want to emphasize the foolishness of the vow that he took. And you can go back and review our last lesson on that. Okay, verses 8 to 15 cover 3 judges, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. In verses 8 to 10, we read about Ibzan. After him, that is after Jephthah, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he gave away 30 daughters in marriage and brought in 30 daughters from elsewhere for his sons. He judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. It says here he had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He gave away 30 daughters in marriage. Now his 30 sons, he brought in 30 daughters from elsewhere for his sons. What this means is that Ibzan, it was very common in the day, Ibzan used marriage in a diplomatic way, as Solomon did. Most of his marriage were marriages for diplomacy. And it looks like Ibzan did the very same thing. I am assuming, and this is an assumption on my part, I don't know that it's the case, but Israel is forbidden to give their sons in marriage to those outside of Israel, those who are not Israelites. So I'm assuming that the women that the diplomacy that he's trying to work on is between tribes in Israel and not foreign nations. But here again, it's not stated in the text, it's just an assumption on my part. Then after him, verses 11 and 12, you have Elon the Zebulunite. He judged Israel 10 years. He died and was buried in Ajalon in the country of Zebulun. And then beginning in verse 13, we read about Abdon. Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 young donkeys. he judged Israel 8 years. And so he has 40 sons and 30 grandsons, and it says they each had a donkey, a young donkey that they rode on. And, when we see a donkey, it really doesn't mean anything to us. We would much rather see a horse, a knight in armor riding on a horse, or a cowboy on a horse, or something like this. But then, and in that culture, and even in some cultures yet today, a donkey was a symbol of wealth and power and influence if you had a son that rode on a donkey. So Abdon evidently was a very, very influential and powerful man. And he ruled for 8 years. Okay, that is going to bring us to the end of Judges chapter 12, the study of Jephthah. And so next time we get into the very exciting story of Samson. We're going to be looking at Judges chapter 13. If you have any questions about tonight's lesson, then I encourage you to contact me through Facebook, or you can send me a message through the church website. Those of you from Northside have my contact information, and anything you would like to ask questions about, you feel free to contact me. Thank you for joining us for this Bible study. God bless you. Have a great day.